have any specific concerns or interests so that I know where to focus as we get moving, or you can think about that a little bit. We can talk about it more in a moment. All right, I'll let you think about that for a little bit. So a little bit on me. I've been here since 2001. I was trained at Loyola, spent some time at Adventist Hospital in Hinsdale and a family practice program there. And then I came right out of practice, and they showed me a cornfield out in Lynn Boulevard and said, this is where you will have your building. And they did come through. I've since moved to the main clinic here, and I've been practicing medicine now for almost 20 years here, and I still take care of my own patients in the hospital, so kind of do a full scope of medicine and see not only the preventive side, but what happens when things go bad. So I think that's an interesting part of this. So my interest in immunizations, I mean, I feel at least half of my job is preventing, avoiding, or at least delaying disease in people. So I'm a big proponent of doing appropriate health screenings and all those sort of things, and certainly immunizations is a big part of that. It's a way that we can keep things from happening and prevent problems. So it's something that I follow closely, because there are certainly things we need to be aware of with them, and specific times where we shouldn't use them, and a lot of times where it's especially important to make sure we get them done even when it's otherwise not typical. So with that, I'll get started. Before I go into all the vaccines in particular, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the concerns and understanding how risk plays into this, because I think it's very, very important. It's very easy, especially in a digital age, for people to come up with scary stories or experiences that they are convinced that relate to an immunization or some other medical procedure. It's a very natural human reaction to want to have something to hold on to. Something bad has happened. I want to be able to say, this is what happened, we figured it out, and this is to blame. I certainly understand where that comes from. I have the picture of the big needle there because it's fundamentally kind of an unnatural feeling thing, needles and poking it through the skin, and so I understand that it feels not right and unnatural for a lot of people. Now, natural is a very abused word these days, but I certainly understand where that comes from, and if there were a nicer, better way than sticking needles in kids, we would certainly want to do that too. We're not monsters, all right? But fundamentally, to get a vaccine to work, the idea of it is it gives you some part of what the virus or bacteria we're trying to prevent looks like, so that it gives your body's immune system a heads up, so it can build some advanced protection against the next time it sees it. And in order to do that, you have to get it into where the immune system is, and that means getting it through the skin. Now, we can do that through weakened viruses that we put in the nose or in the mouth, but these have to be active viruses that then use their normal mechanisms to get through the mucous membranes and into the system so that our immune system responds to them. Or we can take just bits and pieces or dead parts of viruses and put them through the skin so that our immune system can see them in that situation without having to use a live vaccine to do that. So that's part of the reason that needles are often involved. I assume everybody drove here tonight, or did anybody walk? Anybody so bold as to take a motorcycle here? No? I used to own one, but I don't anymore because I got kids, so someday maybe. But I put that up there, that accident, as a kind of a humorous anecdote that the most dangerous thing we do every day is drive. And that risk, a lifetime risk, states vary a little bit. And I was interested to see Illinois is actually not very high up on the risk when I was looking at it, but overall it's about a 1 in 10,000 lifetime risk of dying in a car accident. It's one of the most dangerous things we do. So I want you to keep that risk in mind, that your risk of dying at some point in your life from a car accident is about 1 in 10,000. And yet, we get in the car and we drive every day understanding that risk. In fact, if you think about it, we drive at 100-mile-an-hour closing speeds right at each other on these roads. I don't know who thought that was a good idea to begin with, right? But we're playing chicken every day long, and yet we are comfortable with that, we understand it, and we get away with it most of the time, and we have to live the rest of our life. So we take that risk. We hop in that car and we go, and we live our life. So everything, immunizations included, carries some degree of risk. Doing nothing also carries risk, because if we don't protect, then bad things can happen. So everything in medicine, William Osler, the famous physician, said medicine is about balancing probabilities, all right? There is no all good or all bad. It's the skill of the physician and all the appropriately interpreting what's good data to weigh those risks and benefits for an individual person. And that's very important too, because the situation varies a lot, both on the population of people and the individual person, whether this is appropriate for you or not. So there's a lot that goes into that. All right, so I have this big red letters. Correlation does not equal causation. In other words, things can be associated together, and it seems like, geez, these things always happen together. They must cause each other. So when polio first came out, it was first an issue in the 1940s, there was a very strong association between ice cream sales and polio. In 1949, that very tightly associated. So there was actually an effort to say that kids should avoid ice cream and pop, because this is when when kids eat ice cream is when they get polio. Now, any of you have an idea what's really going on there? Might be a little bit fussy. There's a reason they're connected. Okay, polio happens mostly in the summertime. Kids get in pools, kids get outside, right? When do we sell ice cream? When it's right. So people will show you graphs and say, look at this, how can you tell me that one isn't causing the other? Well, it's because things can have associations. Sometimes they're random, sometimes there's a reason for that association, but it doesn't mean that one causes the other. It's a really important topic, because it's really easy to get sucked into that. So this is not the real cause of polio. It's a humorous anecdote, but you can see how impressive that graph is. So autism, there's been a lot of talk about autism and vaccines over the years. This started back in the 90s when a doctor, who's no longer a doctor for good reason, Wakefield, published a series on a 15 kids, very, very small number of kids, that he thought there was an association. In fact, there's a whole bunch of things that followed that. But to keep it brief, he had a lot to gain from doing that. He ended up losing his medical license over that, and it caused a lot of scares. One of the interesting things that came out of that was immunization rates in Great Britain fell dramatically. So if immunizations were the cause of autism, you should see a similar decline in Britain versus other countries where that wasn't an issue. That didn't happen. Autism continued to increase. So why is autism getting so much more common? The largest part of that is because we've expanded the definition of what autism is. Before 1980, autism was listed under schizophrenia. It wasn't even really its own thing. And around that time, when autism was first its own independent diagnosis, it was a very tight diagnosis for what we would now consider very significantly affected, low-functioning people with autism. As it is right now, over the years, we've expanded this so people who would otherwise be kids who would just learn differently or have some struggles with social interactions, we now put them on the autism spectrum. And we've expanded the definition of autism to be very big. So it's helpful in that we can now get those kids some specific help, and some of them need a little help, some need a lot. So it's definitely helpful that we've expanded that a lot, but we can't compare the diagnosis back then to the diagnosis now, because they're very different definitions. There may also be some other combination of genetic and environmental factors. That's probably a pretty small effect, and it's probably multifactorial. There's a lot of things that go into that, and certainly there's an amazing amount of research going into that. But what we've seen time and time again is that immunization rates do not correlate with autism rates. Very well done long-term studies by multiple different authors. If this was a conspiracy, it would have to be a conspiracy among thousands of scientists and physicians all over the world that are all getting together and somehow not getting rich over this, because those sort of scientists don't make a whole lot of money in general. But especially in some of the countries that have very tightly regulated health systems, some of the Scandinavian countries, they're all in one system, they're all in one computer system. Every diagnosis is very neatly filed, and they can pull out this diagnosis and see, is it associated with an increase in any of these other issues? And if it is, that'll give them a very early signal that there's problems. It won't necessarily say what the problem is, but it'll pick up that problem very early. One example of this was there was, as it applies to vaccines, is there was a vaccine called Rotavirus that came out in the late 90s that protects kids against rotavirus, which is a diarrhea that causes dehydration. In a small number of kids, that immune stimulation caused something called their little tire patches, their little patches of immune cells in the gut, to get excited enough that they get big enough that when the bowel is contracting, it hooks onto those and it telescopes, causing something called intussusception. Pretty rare event, but it was clearly different after the Rotavirus. So that was picked up, and Rotavirus was ultimately taken off the market. Interestingly, Rotavirus may still be a very appropriate vaccine in places that have a lot of problems with rotavirus, like third world countries where they don't have the ability to rehydrate kids and give them IVs. A lot of kids die of rotavirus, and in that case, that risk may be worth taking. But in America, where it's a nasty disease, but very rarely life-threatening, it's probably not worth taking. So that vaccine got taken off the market, and there's a new one that's also been appropriately followed and doesn't have those issues. So anyway, getting back to this, people like to correlate autism with the rise in the number of vaccines, the rise in all sorts of things. You can also correlate it very tightly with the rise in organic food sales, okay? Amazing correlation between those two. Does one cause the other? No, it really doesn't. But it shows you how it's very easy to have very convincing graphs. It just happens that that's a popular trend around the same time as autism. So briefly, just because this is fun, somebody put together some random correlations. So per capita cheese consumption correlates to the number of people who die becoming tangled in their bed sheets. Pretty impressive correlation over time that way as well. Just a random correlation, but it's kind of fun. Japanese passenger cars sold in the US and suicides by crashing a motor vehicle. You can make an argument based on the graph that, geez, it looks like Japanese cars are causing people to kill themselves. That's not really the case, but again, interesting correlation. So those are just for fun. So a lot of things that I see a lot over immunization is concern over ingredients. What about formaldehyde, aluminum, thimerosal? All these things sound scary and bad. And certainly in isolation, that's possible. Let me, and I'll get to the bottom stuff in a moment. Let me go with formaldehyde as a good example. We all, as a part of natural metabolism, make very small amounts of formaldehyde in our bloodstream. If I took a vial of each of our blood, everybody would have a little bit of formaldehyde, more or less, depending on things you ate and your specifics of metabolism. The amount of formaldehyde that's left after in vaccines as a preservative is a lower concentration than what we have in our blood. But it's there, it is there. In large amounts, it causes issues. Anything can be toxic given a certain dose, but we're certainly built to handle small amounts of formaldehyde because we make it. So it's a scary word, and it certainly sounds unnatural, but at the levels that it's in vaccines, not an issue. Aluminum, also similar. It's the most common metal. You know, we cook with it, we wrap our food in aluminum foil. all that transfers a little bit. Breast milk has aluminum foil. Again, a higher concentration, aluminum in it. A higher concentration of aluminum in breast milk than what's in vaccines. With the mercury, that's where this chemistry matters thing comes in. Methyl mercury is really toxic. It's stuff from thermometers. You don't want to get in your fingers. It's problematic. Ethyl mercury sounds very similar, but it's not toxic at anywhere near the same level, and it's also very rapidly excreted. It's been very closely followed to not cause issues. Still, because of concern over that and the interest of just kind of moving on here, it's been removed from most of them. It was part of the ingredients in thimerosal that people talk about. Now, thimerosal has not been associated with issues, but again, because of that level of concern to keep immunization rates up, it's out of everything but multi-dose vials, which we don't use here. It still uses a preservative in multi-dose vials, but most everything is single dose these days. So in order to explain why chemistry matters, I use the example of table salt, right? The stuff you put on your French fries or season with stuff. Now, table salt is sodium, Na, and chloride. Those are the ingredients, so to speak, to table salt. Nobody's afraid of table salt, but if you divide it up into its ingredients, sodium and chloride, you should be very afraid. Let me see if this. Can we make the first one play? So sodium on its own, without the chloride attached, is a metal, a highly unstable metal that has to be in oil because it's so reactive. And I have a little video here that shows what happens if you throw sodium into water. Well, I don't know, I guess we don't have volume there.
Oh,
It's
sorry.
pretty darn unstable stuff. So you can hear it blowing up as it hits the water. It causes actual explosions. I'm going to let this run just for a little while longer, but not through the whole thing, because I want you to see what sodium looks like. This is not stuff you'd put on your French fries so again, they have to, when they ship it, it has all these danger things on it because it's pretty unstable stuff. And they have to ship it in oil to keep it inert. Take it out of there, and in a moment they're gonna cut it. Interestingly, another interesting random trivia about sodium is it's a metal that cuts kind of like butter, so you can't actually cut it with a regular kitchen knife. When they cut it, and you see the fresh cut surface that isn't oxidized a little bit, you'll see that it's really shiny. It kind of looks like aluminum. This is not stuff you'd rub on your corn on the cob, right? It looks pretty ugly. If I told you that that's what's in your food, you'd think it's a real problem. I mean, it lights on fire when you throw it in water. How is that safe? So we can stop that now. Chloride on its own is a poison gas. It was used in World War I to kill thousands of people. They made chloride gas. It's pretty easy to make, and they would put it across enemy lines if the wind was going the right way, and at high concentrations, it's very deadly. It's very irritating. We got to go back to present. No, right.
Tell me where it is, Doc. Oh, okay.
Go up. Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
So each of these things individually, really terrible things. You put them together, it makes some yummy table salt. So chemistry matters, and it's very easy to get really wrapped up in all these unnatural things that are in there if you don't have a good understanding of that. So I actually went through a lot of this already. So I think I covered that pretty well when I was talking about it before. So this is a question again. Don't the ingredients found in vaccines hurt children? Because they sound scary. The answer is they don't, and we have very good data to support that because we do follow this very, very closely. There's nationwide databases and something called the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. Anybody can say, I've had this thing happen after I've had an immunization. It doesn't mean it was connected, but it helps us gather data. And if the scientists see a lot of correlation between two things, they'll go investigate that. It's a good way to make sure we're aware of things that are emerging. Most of these things don't pan out, but sometimes, like in the case of the Rotavirus, they do. So when people say there's been no safety studies, first of all, there are pre-marketing safety studies that are pretty comprehensive. The second thing is we, on an ongoing basis, over dozens of years, follow millions of people for any sign of adverse reactions from that. Because it's such a big issue, it's one of the most closely followed things that we have. It's one of the things that we're most sure is safe in medicine because we follow this so closely, and because they're kind of discrete events. We know when we gave the immunization, we know, the diagnosis that came right after that, especially in an age of computerized medical records. We can see when things start to come together and if there are problems. And those are certainly things that we need to look into and check into as they come up. But when you have millions of cases that don't show a correlation, they're pretty good evidence. Now, anytime you're giving people millions of doses of things, just by random events, certain things are going to fall after that and happen after that. And again, if you happen to have something very bad happen after somebody stuck a needle in your arm, it's very understandable and very much human nature that this has to be related. It must have done that to me. Most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time that's not the case. So this is what I see a lot. How can someone who is not vaccinated be a threat to someone who is vaccinated if vaccines work? Right? Why should we worry about it? You can not do your vaccine thing. I'll just get vaccinated and I'll be fine. I have a little video after this talking about herd immunity. But the other thing is, vaccines vary in their effectiveness. Influenza's one of the lower effectiveness. It decreases rates of influenza by about 40 to 60% depending on the year. The new Shingles vaccine is one of the most effective. It decreases the rate of shingles by 95%. And there are reasons for that difference, and we can get to that in a moment. But none of them are 100%. So if we don't protect each other, then it fails more often. So if you don't get a vaccination for yourself, get it for your kid, get it for your grandparent. So let's move on to the video. It's about 2 minutes or so, but it's helpful in understanding this. Need the volume up for sure.
Vaccines protect us in two ways. Firstly, they protect the individual against serious infectious diseases. In the case of measles, for example, over 99% of people who get 2 doses of the MMR vaccine will be completely protected against catching measles. But there is a second way in which vaccines protect us. If the vaccine stops you catching the disease, you can't pass it on to anyone else. This means that when enough people in the population are protected by vaccination, it effectively stops diseases from circulating at all. This is often called herd immunity, but a better name is herd protection, because it helps to protect those who are especially vulnerable to infectious diseases. This includes all newborn babies, because they are too young to be vaccinated, older people, because our immune systems become less effective as we age, people with cancer or an organ transplant, because they are on treatments that seriously weaken the immune system, and people who get vaccinated but just don't make a response to the vaccine for reasons we don't yet fully understand. You will certainly know people in some of these groups. You may have them in your family now or in the future. Perhaps you are in one of these groups yourself. If everyone around these vulnerable individuals is fully vaccinated, it will help protect them against serious diseases like measles that could kill them. So even if you don't feel at risk from a disease yourself, getting vaccinated benefits others in your community and your family. Sometimes herd immunity is used as a reason not to vaccinate. It sounds reasonable. If everyone around you is vaccinated and you are protected by herd immunity, surely it can't make any difference if you don't get vaccinated yourself. The problem is that if enough people behave like this, vaccination rates will soon fall, and their diseases will start to circulate again. This is particularly true for very infectious diseases such as measles. It's also important to realise that herd immunity doesn't guarantee protection. People who don't get vaccinated tend to cluster together in communities, So if a disease outbreak does occur, it's much more likely to spread within these communities than in the population as a whole. And herd immunity doesn't work at all for some diseases like tetanus, which is caught from bacteria in the environment rather than other people. So, getting vaccinated gives us the best chance of individual protection, as well as helping to protect some of the most vulnerable people in our society.
Okay, any questions on that? What he's talking about with people clustering is why we see clusters of measles outbreaks in New York and Minnesota. There's high rates of low rates of vaccination in those areas because there's been a concerted effort to target new immigrants and other people who are easily influenced with, frankly, scare tactics, and they have lower immunization rates, and we see these things pop up. There's also several areas in Europe that we've seen that. And we've actually, we had measles essentially eliminated in the United States over a decade ago, and now we've had 700 some cases this year because of those pockets. All it takes is someone flying in to a susceptible group of people, and oftentimes the people who are most concerned are immigrants, and they have people coming in and out of the country. And if one person's on a plane, they may not even know they're sick yet. They may still be in the incubation phase. They were exposed to somebody, but they're not sick yet. Then they go circulate, and something like measles is amazingly contagious. We could have somebody who has had measles in this room, if we weren't immune to it, have measles in this room half an hour ago. They're long gone. And if we were in this room long enough, most of us would get measles. It's that contagious. So for those sort of diseases, fortunately, we have probably the most effective vaccine in the measles vaccine that works very well with it's 93% with one dose, about 99% with two doses. But you still have to get it, and you have to have enough people that get it. So you may wonder why I'm a little bit passionate about this. Even though we generally have pretty good immunization rates around here, which I'm very happy with, there are still some pockets of people who don't get immunized. I had one example a few years ago where I had a baby that was too young to get immunized. Their cousin was in a non-immunizing family. Now that cousin got pertussis or whooping cough. In adolescents and adults, it's a miserable illness, sometimes known in other countries as the 100-day cough, but not very often life-threatening. But if an infant gets that, it is very much life-threatening. I took care of that infant. Even with all we have with modern medicine, and yes, we give them antibiotics, but the antibiotics mostly help to make them contagious for a short period of time. The cat's already out of the barn as far as what it does to the infant. It doesn't really change the course of their disease much. So basically, they cough to the point that they get blue and choke and start to stop breathing, and we have to flick their feet or stimulate them or in some way to get them to breathe again. And this happens over and over, every few minutes for a week, few weeks, and if they get bad enough, we have to put them on life support and ventilate them artificially. And watching a kid go through this is extremely heartbreaking, and this is very preventable. It didn't have to happen. So I'm going to warn you, this video is a little disturbing. So if babies that are struggling really bother you, be aware. Okay, go ahead. Normally healthy baby here. Still coughing, not breathing. Not breathing. Little breath. That's the alarm going off that the oxygen levels are getting low. So people will tell you, no, go ahead, you have a question?
Why aren't you covering your cough? You're always told to cover a cough.
I didn't take care of this person, so I don't know what the specifics are, but as far as this kid with measles, mom has probably been immunized, has a 99% protection rate. You can't really cover the kid because it makes it harder to breathe. We can't put a mask on the kid. They're not particularly effective, and we don't need to do anything to make it harder to breathe yet. And mom could wear a mask, but the odds are that she would be completely protected by that mask over the time that she is there is pretty small, not necessarily worth all the discomfort. Now, if she were not immunized, absolutely, you gotta immunize her and do all those things, really not have her around that. But in all likelihood, if she were not immunized, by the time we knew that they're sick, she's already got it, so we're too late. But no, please, by all means, keep asking questions. We love it.
So, before the kids can start school, they have to be up on their immunizations. Is that not correct anymore?
There are exemptions possible. Now, it used to be for any sort of religious belief at all in Illinois, and people would kind of invent their own religion and say this is against my religion. Now, the way the Illinois statute is, the person is required to go to their healthcare provider for an explanation of why this is important and what they're risking. So we give them the long talk, and again, most of the times not vaccinating, the parents are not trying to do the wrong thing. They're not trying to be difficult or evil. They're scared, and I get it. It's your kid. You're putting a needle in the kid. It doesn't seem right. But we have to help them understand the greater good, and certainly that the risks, they're not zero, but they are far outweighed by the benefits. And sometimes it takes personal stories like this. I also practiced at a time before, when I was in training, we didn't have the Haemophilus influenza vaccine and pneumonia vaccines. And we had very, very high rates of neonatal meningitis and very bad ear infections. And I saw a lot of these in training. This was right about the time we were starting those immunizations. I've been in practice here 20 years. I haven't seen a case of neonatal meningitis since I've been in practice here. It's amazing the difference that I've seen in my time of practice. I'm not that old, so it is impressive. In fact, around the time that I was in residency, there were a bunch of pediatric hospitals that closed, didn't have business anymore for these kids. So we had to reschedule some of our training rotations because places that were busy weren't anymore. So there is definitely a very a large good. But getting back to how that all works, so we talk to them and try and help them understand. That's really my job, is to do my best to help them understand. Not tell them they're a bad parent or they're trying to do bad things, but to help them understand. Once that's done, we sign off that we have given them the education. Then it's up to the health department to say if their concern is legitimate or not, with regards to do they need to not immunize. There are cases that it is legitimate. There are some kids who have specific allergies. We can be allergic to anything. It's extremely rare, but it does happen. And those are the kids that we need to protect, right? Those are the kids that can't get immunized. If everybody else around them is immunized, then they're safe. But we can't do that if we don't have everybody else safe. Fortunately, those laws around the country are getting tighter because we're seeing what happens in New York and California and Minnesota about when this gets out of hand. You drop below a certain level of protection and things escalate quickly. And bad things happen. I mean, measles is not a nice disease. So anyway, that's one of my own personal examples. This was, as a provider, it was an extremely hard thing. I want to fix this kid. I want to make them better. Unfortunately, there's nothing I can do except keep them in the hospital and keep stimulating them and wait it out and hope that they survive. And it almost brings tears to my eyes because it's something that makes me sad and makes me angry. So this is part of what makes me passionate about the whole subject. So back on topic, the vaccines themselves, where to start? There's lots of different vaccinations out there. Given that we have a little bit of an older crowd, we could start with pneumonia vaccines and shingles vaccines, or do you guys have other interests and thoughts? I want to get to Gardasil because it's controversial, but we'll do that in a moment. Yes?
I have never got a flu shot, and the doctor here insisted I get one.
Right?
But you read in ingredients, and it has ethylene glucose, which is antifreeze.
No, it has something that sounds like antifreeze in it, okay? Again, remember we get back to the chemistry matters thing, right? If somebody, and let me put it this way, if somebody's trying to sell a vaccine, because they have to do that, right? They're a company, they have to market it. They wouldn't put something in that does that to people because they wouldn't sell it, all right? It wouldn't make sense. Now, as far as influenza, it's kind of like wearing my seatbelt. You can drive around a long time without your seatbelt and you'll be just fine, odds are. Years maybe your lifetime you can drive around without that. And you say, what's the use of seatbelts? I'm fine, I feel great. I don't have that thing rubbing on my neck. I won't be trapped in a car, I'll be thrown clear. All the things, but we all heard this when seatbelt, most of us are old enough to know when seatbelts first came out, right? People were like, oh, I don't want to be trapped in, I want to be thrown clear. We now know that seatbelts, though yes, they hurt people every now and then, right? Things go bad with that. They are, by and large, much more benefit than risk. And immunizations are much the same way. Now with influenza, again, you can get away with it a long time. Or you could be a good friend of mine who was 50 years old. I saw him out in front of Kenny's a week before. He was 50 years old in perfect health. And less than 2 weeks later, 1 week later he was sick, 2 weeks later he was dead from influenza. Because sometimes it's a really nasty disease. You get secondary pneumonias and that sort of stuff. Also, in part because the flu vaccine is between 40 and 60% effective, it's really important that as many people as possible get it so you get the best benefit of herd immunity, right? If you, even though you're only decreasing it in about half the people, those half the people can give it to somebody else, and that multiplies. Last year we had pretty good immunization rates and fairly good coverage of the influenza vaccine, and though it was a long flu season, it was fairly mild. The season before, not so much. It was one of the worst since the 2009 H1N1. So I'll get back to influenza in a moment, but does that answer your question? Okay. All right, let's get to pneumonia. Well, we might get back to meningitis in a little bit. So pneumonia vaccines target certain bacterial strains that often cause pneumonia, though they can cause infections elsewhere. Remember I talked about in children, that was one of the things that can cause meningitis in children, and immunizing kids has made a dramatic impact in that. They don't protect against pneumonia caused by other types of bacteria, so they don't immunize you against pneumonia as a whole. They immunize you against certain common bugs that can cause bad types of pneumonia. So unfortunately, we don't have something that protects us against all forms of pneumonia every time, but again, it's that seatbelt. We can reduce the risk quite a bit. There's been some new developments here, so I'll get to that in a moment. 2 types of pneumonia vaccines. There's the Pneumovax, which has been around for quite a while. It covers 23 different strains of pneumonia. It's recommended for everybody at 65 years old, one time only. If you've gotten one before, we still repeat it at 65 as long as it's been at least 5 years, but then you're done. You get it one time only after 65. Anybody who smoked, interestingly, the ages are greater than 2 years old. God, I hope you're not smoking at 2 years old. But in any case, anybody who smokes from kid on up, they're now recommending that. People with chronic liver, lung, or heart disease. This is a lot of people, diabetes and some other medical conditions. Once you get it, you repeat it once after 5 years, and then we don't do it until you're 65 again.
So you don't initially get it to your 65?
Not unless you have one of these other
Right.
conditions.
And then it doesn't matter what the age?
As far
Or
as
should you be like 50 and over, or it doesn't matter if you're
If-
30 or?
if you have one of these conditions, you
Uh-huh.
get it at
Anytime.
any time. And you know, this is something that's probably underutilized some, and I gotta say this is something that doing the research for this, I'm probably not using it often enough, and I will in more people who are at risk. So there's that. There's also one that we've used in kids for a long time. This is the one that came out when I was in training and was real helpful for kids. They started recommending it for adults a few years ago as well. This PCV stands for pneumococcal conjugate vaccine. It actually provokes a little better immune response to these 13 than the Pneumovax does. So it was recommended, we start that first at 65 and actually give the Pneumovax a year later. This year there's been an update on that. It's now considered optional in people who are 65 and older. There's a very interesting reason for that. It's not that it doesn't work really well. It is. It's very effective for those 13 strains. The interesting thing is, because we've been giving it to kids for a long time now, kids are who carry the most of those strains. They have the biggest burden. It's adults that often get the pneumonias and get really sick from it, but the biggest pool was in kids. Now that we're immunizing all the kids, the number of these strains of pneumococcus have gone way down. So the pool of disease has become very small. And it's rare enough, now that the kids are all gone, that it's not entirely clear that it's terribly effective in adults, because it's just rare enough. Those strains are, I don't want to say they're gone, but they're low enough that it's becoming less worthwhile to give another vaccination for that. So then it becomes, well, who do we give it to? Certainly anybody who's high risk, they definitely deserve that. And if personally, I think if you don't tend to have trouble with these sorts of things, you don't tend to have reactions that doesn't make you miserable, and we'll get into why that happens sometimes in a moment. It's probably still worthwhile doing. Maybe in a few years, as that effect increases, because again, we keep giving it to kids. The kids who got it originally get older. There's a bigger proportion of the population that's just protected against this. So that becomes less and less important. I think I would probably still do it at this point, but it is optional at this point. It's not specifically recommended in everyone. That's new this year. So the conspiracy theorists that think we're only trying to sell these things, there are times that when it's appropriate, we do dial back on these things. Next one, shingles. How many in this room have had shingles, if you wouldn't mind saying? Okay, wow, you guys are really lucky. That's fantastic. I certainly see it a lot, and it's miserable, especially if it tends to get on your face. The lifetime risk of shingles is 1 in 5. So we got, 15 people in this room? About 5 of you or so are, if you're not protected, are likely to get shingles. Unfortunately,
Do you think it's happening in younger? I mean, my brother-in-law had it. He wasn't 50 yet.
It's interesting. I'm not aware of data saying that that's definitely happening. It seems maybe we're just more aware of it, but it does seem like we anecdotally see it a little bit more. Jumping ahead here a little bit, you can get the shingles vaccine anytime after 50. All right, the label insert says it's approved for over 50. The CDC says the rates of shingles get significantly higher after 60. Therefore, we definitely feel that everybody 60 and above should get it. Between 50 and 60, it's still optional. So moving back to what happens with this, you don't get shingles from somebody else. You get shingles from the same chickenpox virus that you had as a kid. It never went away. Your immune system just tucked it into a corner out of the way. But it's still there, it's waiting for a good opening opportunity. You get run down, your immune system is not working so well anymore. It finds its way out of its little cage and runs down one nerve. If that nerve happens to be the one in your face that involves your eye, it can make you go blind. And the other thing that's pretty scary is it causes a lot of pain, not only right away, but the nerve damage in 20% of people that lasts for 3 months, and 15% of people it's still there 2 years later. So I tend to talk about vaccines some on my Facebook page. And when people start to doubt this, I have the people with post-herpetic neuralgia years later who will chime in and say, my life is not the same. I am reminded every day that I'm miserable from this thing. And get your shingles vaccine. So, 4 to 5 times you'll be okay if you don't get it. Yes?
You said the pain, you went and used your eye. Where does it actually show up? Only in your face? Or?
No, it can, anywhere you have a nerve, it can show up.
So your pain could be anywhere on your body?
Yes. Now, it typically follows the course of one nerve, and typical of this rash is it's on one side. So what you'll see in this rash, like if it's on the forehead, it'll go across here and it'll stop right in the middle. It'll be just this side, it'll stop right in the middle because that's where the nerve ends. If a rash crosses the midline, it's typically not shingles.
So it's not contagious?
Not in the way you would think. No, you're not going to give somebody else shingles. Now, that chickenpox virus is in that rash, so if someone has not had the chickenpox and they haven't been immunized, you could potentially give somebody chickenpox. So we worry about you around pregnant women and stuff like that, where or newborns. So that's what you have to be aware of. Not that you're going to give your neighbor shingles, but that it is possible to transmit chickenpox to somebody.
Since we're in the month of August, when I turned 60 in March, I called CVS and Walgreens, and they are out of serum. Why? And they are looking at a 3-month back. Why is there not enough serum out there for the people that want to go to their local pharmacists?
It's a problem.
So we talk about getting it, but you don't have it available.
Right. So the manufacturer of this grossly underestimated the response, and they didn't make enough. So there is a national back order on this stuff everywhere.
Would you include the health department too?
Yes.
I did not call there until she said it.
Now, that said, get yourself on a waiting list. It shows up here and there, and the
Oh,
shortage.
so you have to actually sign up and just not hang up and call another pharmacist and hang up. You gotta get signed up.
Yeah. The shortage is getting less. They are catching up. So in my clinic, we're starting to see some. Now, there's another problem with the Shingles vaccine, though, and that's that it's not very well covered. So,
You mean insurance-wise?
right.
And it's expensive.
And it's expensive. Now, fortunately, if you're a hospital employee, they cover it very well. But if you have Medicare, now this is very cynical of me, but shingles tends to not land you in the hospital. Typically, it just makes you really miserable. All right. Landing you in the hospital costs Medicare money, right? So if they give you a pneumonia vaccine, you don't end up in the hospital, Medicare saves money. So they cover those vaccines very, very well. The shingles vaccine tends to not cost a lot of money to treat the problems with that. It just hurts for a long time. So I don't know this, and maybe I'm exposing my own conspiracy theory side, but
it makes sense.
the Medicare does not cover that well. It does cover it to a degree, but typically out-of-pocket costs range between $300 and $400 for the 2-dose series. So that's not great. So, have any of you guys in here had the older Zostavax? Okay.
And that, and I've also had the shingles.
Okay, good.
And
You're
so
very
far-
well protected.
I had it, got it, both shots a year ago.
Right, okay. So the Zostavax is what we had before Shingles came out in 2017. That was a live weakened virus, so we had to be a little careful in who we gave it to. People with immune compromising conditions, it could cause that to come out. And you know, you could potentially, for a short period of time, be contagious to other people if they didn't have the chickenpox. It decreased the rates of shingles between 50 and 60%. Yes,
You made a comment about it in 2 shots or whatever.
for the Shingrix, yes.
How about the others?
The Zostavax is 1 shot only. That part's nice. But it's only 50 to 60% effective, which is the best we had for a while, but Shingrix is clearly a lot better. Now, part of what makes Shingrix better is it does have an ingredient in it, something called an adjuvant, that alerts your immune system that something's up and go look for trouble, so to speak. When we do that, it makes us able to use a lot less of the actual antigen and also get a much better, much more robust immune response. It's looking like we probably won't need more boosters of Shingrix. It's not fully decided yet, but the immunity seems to be very durable. It's lasting a long time, in part because of that. But when we do that, it does make you sometimes feel a little achy flu-like, because it does get your immune system revved up. Now, you're not actually infected or sick, but your immune system is busy and you can have some low-grade fevers. It can act like you're sick. This happens a fair amount with your first dose of influenza, which is why people will sometimes say, they gave me the shot and it gave me influenza. Didn't give you influenza, but it may have made you feel unwell, especially the first time. That is possible. I'm not here to say it's all unicorns and rainbows with this. And in some people that effect is pretty significant. The vast majority of people that tends to go away with future shots. Your body's immune system says, okay, we've seen something like this before, we know what to do with it, it's not as big a reaction. But it still is hard, and again, there are some people that just seem to get miserable enough from it that maybe it's not worth it. And that's an individual decision between you and your doctor. So with Shingrix, there is a little bit more of that than there was with the Zostavax, but it's a lot more effective. That's the upside. Yes?
Do you ever get well with shingles that you don't, and will you not get it again?
So after you get the shingles, there is a time that it's significantly less likely to get it. You're kind of giving yourself your own little, you had your own little booster. So after you've had the shingles, we don't recommend getting the Shingrix shot for at least a year or so afterwards, because you're pretty well protected during that time. Unfortunately, that immunity does not, without that adjuvant, it doesn't seem to be as durable or long lasting. So people do get shingles sometimes numerous times. Yeah, especially, depends a lot on how robust your immune system is. If you're getting chemotherapy or you're on steroids for treatment of another condition, it can still come out for sure.
Okay, I got 2 grandsons and 1 on the way. And the chickenpox vaccine that they're giving the kids, does that mean that those kids aren't going to get shingles?
So, interestingly, no, they can still get shingles from that.
They just don't get chickenpox.
They won't, well, yes, and both the rate and the severity of the shingles that they get is less in people who are vaccinated than people who actually had the shingles or the chickenpox to begin with. So I wish it prevented that. It does not. Okay, but it does seem to make it less often and less severe. But at some day, those kids will still have to get a Shingrix vaccine or whatever the best one we have.
So as a child, if I didn't have chickenpox, I could still get shingles?
If you got the vaccine, yes. If you've
Well,
never
they
had
didn't have the
chickenpox,
vaccine
you
when I
can't
was
get,
little.
what's that?
They didn't have the chickenpox vaccine when I was little.
No, me neither. I got the chickenpox.
So my mom took me somewhere to get them.
Yeah,
Let's get them over with before school starts.
right. Well, that was your only option, and people still do that, okay?
Yeah.
And they think, well, it's better to have the natural disease. I will tell you, again, I practiced before the chickenpox vaccine was in full use. I was in the ICUs with kids that had really bad chickenpox. They had chickenpox down their throat. They had to put feeding tubes down their throat. They had secondary infections of these chickenpox. and they had abscesses and boils and secondary infections. There's more than 100 kids a year that died of complications of chickenpox. So it's not necessarily a benign disease, and I don't see that stuff anymore. So it's not only just to keep kids from getting miserable. Again, in a digital age, we hear all about what people think terrible things happen. We forget very quickly how bad it was before. I take care of people who had polio. We don't have polio anymore, but we can in countries where immunization rates are not great. It's still there. It's almost gone. The Rotary Club's doing a fantastic job trying to get this eradicated. That's their goal, and they may well do it. But it's these conspiracy theories that scare people that keep it from getting quite there. We've eliminated smallpox. Smallpox is gone except for laboratories. You know, we haven't had a natural wild case in ages. And it's an interesting evolution with vaccines as well. We used to do the oral polio vaccine. It was a live weakened virus because it was a little more effective, and it also, you would immunize other people by giving them the same live weakened virus like you would give them a cold or in the past polio, so it would spread. So that was helpful up until the point that we eliminated the natural polio almost down to nothing, and all that was left was the vaccine-associated polio. Now, we switched back to the injectable inactivated polio, though it's slightly less effective. Once we've essentially eliminated the natural pool of polio, giving a few people vaccine-associated polio isn't worth it anymore. It's not worth the benefit, and the injectable is good enough to keep us out of trouble as long as we don't have a high circulating population of people with polio. Any other questions on Zostavax or Shingrix? All right, HPV. I told you this is the one I want to get to a little bit because it's really controversial. There's a lot of, HPV is a sexually transmitted disease, so people don't like to talk about that. People don't like to think about their kid and sexually transmitted disease. This is not going to happen to my kid. My kid's good, right? So, again, I understand where people. I have two daughters, 15 and 17. Let me tell you, I have very high expectations for those two. If you're listening, anyway. So let's talk a little bit about HPV, and then I'll get to the vaccine for that. So HPV is human papillomavirus. 70% of adults acquire HPV during their lifetime. There's lots of different strains, many. There's only a few that tend to be associated with cancer. Some of them are associated with genital warts, some with cancer. Most people, they clear the HPV, their immune system gets rid of it. Some people aren't very good at doing that, and if the HPV sticks around, it causes warts or abnormal cells that can turn into cancer in the future. That often takes 20 years. In fact, I think the average time between when you get HPV and when the cancer happens is about 23 years. So this is pretty far separated, and it takes a while for any intervention to filter through and cause those results. So years back, you would hear, well, geez, we've been giving the Gardasil vaccine for 5 or 8 years, and we're not seeing a decrease in cancer rates yet. Up until recently, that was largely true because there hadn't been enough time for that to happen. We knew we were getting rid of the people who got the Gardasil vaccine didn't have the high-risk HPV types that tend to lead to cancer, but it's only recently that we've been able to show pretty good reductions in actual cancer rates because that takes a while to develop. So that argument is no longer valid anymore, but you'll still see it out there based on old data. Importantly, and interestingly, this is not just cervical cancer. This is what we looked at initially. That has 12,000 cases a year and about 4,000 deaths per year. But you also get throat, penile, prostate cancer, anywhere you can get sexual fluids, and there are lots of ways that these can be transmitted that don't involve making babies, okay? So people feel, oh, my kid's not gonna do that. It doesn't take as much as you think. I've had 2 patients in their 40s that had throat cancer that were HPV related. I've had one colleague of mine die from an HPV related throat cancer. These are people in their 40s. Remember, this takes 20 years or so to develop, on average, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. Throat cancer is one of the more miserable cancers, tonsil, throat, getting it cut out of there, getting radiation there. It's a miserable experience, okay? And walking those people through, 2 out of the 3 people that I was involved with that made it, but their lives they went through hell to get there, and their lives are not the same. They got a lot of radiation to deal with that, they got a lot of surgery, and these are all things that if we could rewind the clock, these are preventable. These did not have to happen. I think it's amazing and wonderful. We talk about the cure for cancer. Cancer is a lot of different things. There's no a cure for cancer, but we can prevent a lot of cancers through this. It's just we got to get on this now, and it'll play out over time as it's starting to do. So there's an estimated 30,700 deaths per year from HPV-related cancers that we know about. We keep finding more cancers that have HPV DNA involved in the genesis of their cancer. That's not far from the 40,000 people a year that die of breast cancer. If we had a vaccine for breast cancer, can you imagine how popular that would be? That people would say, man, this is amazing, I gotta go get this. We have a vaccine that's not that far away in terms of cancers that are much less treatable. And my wife had breast cancer. She knows that I talk about this. She doesn't mind me talking about that. She did all the right things. She breastfed. She did all those things. Sometimes you're just unlucky. So she caught it early. She got her mammogram. Get your mammograms, okay? They found it very early. She didn't need chemo or radiation. But I would have loved it if there was something that could have kept her from getting that. We don't have that yet. Hopefully we will someday. But breast cancer has very good survival and treatment rates that among the best of cancers. These throat cancers and stuff like that, they're a lot tougher. So preventing them is in some ways even a bigger deal. But we're all about breast cancer prevention, which is fantastic, right? But this is a big deal, and it's getting lost in all the controversy about not my kid, don't do that to my kid's not sexually active. I don't want my kid to feel like they can have sex because they have this vaccine, which is always interesting to me, right? Take yourself back to your childhood, or hopefully not your childhood, sometime early adulthood. Do you really think that entered your mind when you were hopping in the sack? I don't think so. And in any case, the other interesting thing to me is 11,500 of these deaths are in men. All right, we think about this in terms of the girls have to get it. No, the boys get about 1/3 of the damage from this, so they should get it too, and they won't pass it to the girls because oftentimes they don't know. We can get some warts inside their urethra, and we don't know anything about it, and then we give it to the women, and they get the bad end of things, which is often the case with sexually transmitted diseases. The guys have no idea; the women have the worst outcomes. Genital warts. This is a really traumatic thing to have happen to your high school kid or college kid. And I can't say, no, don't worry, we'll fix it, we'll just get rid of the HPV. I can't do that. All I can do is say, every time you get a genital wart, come in and I'll get my cryo gun out and freeze this off your man sausage or whatever it is. All right? Again, why this is sexually transmitted, any fluids, fluids in contact with sexual type fluids can transmit this. The thing about not my kid, I looked up the numbers on this. About 95% of persons entering marriage these days will have at least one previous sexual encounter. And this doesn't really even include the messing around that can also transmit this. In highly religious families, this rate drops to about 80%. So 20% of kids have state versions. Now remember, both partners have to have no partners for there to be no risk of HPV. Those are pretty long odds to say my kid's going to be fine because they're a good kid, especially in something that's very preventable and very low risk. So let me get to that. So Gardasil, it's not that new anymore. It was approved in 2006. It was mandated in Australia very early on. So we have a big set of data that we're following about how people do with this in Australia. Early on, we started to see a lot less abnormal pap smears and atypical cells, we are now starting to see the reductions in cancer that we're expecting. Is it's starting to approach the time that these things start to get bad. So that's very encouraging to see. Over 270 million doses have been given, right? And again, all these people, especially in those countries like Scandinavian countries where everything's in one system, all one computer system, all these people are tracked, and we can see very closely, are there increased rates of problems? There were certainly reports, people would get Guillain-Barré syndrome and ascending paralysis after they had immunizations. So we looked at that because that's plausible. Guillain-Barré is when your body mistakes some of its own nerve cell covering, the insulation, with something that it saw, a cold or a virus, something like that looks like a little antigen on the coverings to your nerve, and your body's own immune system attacks those coverings and it leaves your nerves raw, and you have basically a short circuit sort of problem with that. I've seen one of those cases when I was a resident. A kid came in and was having, over the course of 36 hours or so, an ascending paralysis. He had an infection before that. So it is plausible that vaccines could do that. We've looked at that very closely with the Gardasil because we want to know. We don't want to bury our head in the sand here. If it's an issue, we want to know how big that is and if it's worth taking that risk. And certainly people have had it after vaccines. But again, remember those random correlations. You give people 270 million people something, and at some point that's going to intersect with somebody who's had another bad event happen. All right, they may have had Cheerios the morning before they had that start too, but it's not the Cheerios that did it to them. What we follow is that rate increasing? So they've looked at that, and we followed this very closely because we knew to look for it. So the most recent study just came out, 790,000 Danish women, no signal of increased disease. So the people who got the vaccine and the people who didn't, they didn't get more Guillain-Barré. They didn't have more other problems as well. At least 10 other well-done long-term studies, up to 3 million women, have showed no associations other than passing out after the injection. And imagine, you're giving it in the beginning, especially to young girls. This happens, and is it a side effect or complication? Absolutely. You do have to be aware of it. You don't want to give this to people and not be around them, or warn them that that's at least a possibility to keep an eye on things. Usually it happens kind of right away, and we're there and we catch this, but that does happen. So we know that over 90% of cancer-causing HPV are prevented. So this is what I talked about. Rates of abnormal hepatospheres have dropped, and early decreases in cancer rates are now starting to be seen. So all these random associations, every time that someone has one of these random associations, the anti-vaccine advocacy groups latch onto this because they make for very compelling cases. They're young people. They've had something terrible happen, and it happened shortly after they got a vaccine. It's very scary. I get why that scares patients and parents. I get that. It's very compelling. So it's important to know, though, that why those things happen, they're not related to the vaccine. And science is imperfect, but this is as good a data as we have in medicine, all right? If you're comfortable with me recommending your kid for an antibiotic or telling the surgeon to cut out their gallbladder, I have far more data to say that this is safe than that's safe. And people will let me do those things to their kid, but they get uncomfortable when we start talking about these things. There's very good data on this because we have a lot of people, we follow them very closely. We know. So influenza, we talked about this a fair amount. One thing I didn't cover well is flu shots prevent the cold, prevent the flu, not colds. And I get this a lot. Doc, I got the flu shot last year and I got the worst cold and it lasted for a month. That flu shot is worthless. Like, well, I'm sorry, but that's not what it's designed to do. It's really designed to have you stay away from the really bad effects of influenza And for those of you who here has had a true case of influenza, 104 fever, has been miserable, pretty bad few days, huh? You know, my wife missed a flu shot one year. And this could have happened even if she got her flu shot, because flu shots are not perfect. But as you know, her risk was certainly higher that year. She got influenza, and she got really, really sick. And this was at Christmas time. So of course, the ER's packed. I'm a resident in training. She's feeling miserable. She's throwing up all over the place. She's got a high fever. So at the end of the day, I went around and got a bunch of IV fluids and took a picture down off the wall and plugged her in. It took me 3 tries to get her IV started because I was pretty nervous. But she's not missed flu shots since then. And you know, I have never had influenza. I mean, I get exposed to it all the time. I get my flu shot every year, and you know, that's certainly related. Am I a little lucky too? Yeah, I'm a little lucky. Maybe I have a particularly robust immune system in that sense, but I find it hard to believe I would have never had this if I didn't have some level of protection. And for me, again, it's a big deal because I'm seeing it all the time. It's also important for me because if I got it, I could transmit it to a lot of people who are very vulnerable. And that's very, very important in healthcare, right? We take care of the sickest people. We have the biggest responsibility to not give it to somebody else, inadvertently or otherwise. So I get very frustrated with certain healthcare workers that say, I don't want to do this, it's my right. You chose a profession where you have responsibilities, and part of that responsibility is to do everything you can, even if it's sometimes fairly small, to protect your patients. And you don't always know. You're contagious before you're sick. So even if you say, well, I'll stop as soon as I get sick, it's too late. You're the most contagious right when you start to get symptoms. Another thing at the bottom, for the needle averse, the formulation of the nasal vaccine has changed. It was recommended against last year because it seemed to be less effective. It's only in younger people. Before it was only in the mid-40s that it was allowed to be used. But for kids and all that, it's certainly somewhat nicer. Now again, this is because, remember, when we sprayed up the nose, it's got to be a live weakened virus because it's got to climb its way in. We're not injecting it. But they reformulated it, seems to be more effective. Again, jury's still out whether that's going to absolutely prove to be the case this year, but it is again recommended. It seems to be that it would be more effective. Another interesting thing in the flu this year, they waited a little bit longer to recommend the ingredients in this year's flu shots because there was some debate about which one was going to be most effective based on what's circulating the rest of the world. So it was delayed a few weeks before they gave the go-ahead for what that is. That might result in a little delay in getting the flu vaccine out there. We're not sure yet. They're trying to make up for that time. But it does seem like so far we have a pretty good match. Now again, the flu, part of the reason flu shot effectiveness rates are 40 to 60% are that the flu's sneaky. It keeps changing those little surface proteins that allow us to find it. That's why we can keep getting flu over and over. We still get some protection from having had it before, but it's not complete. So is it possible that the flu could change on us and we're completely off this year? It is. Usually that rate of protection is not 0%. And when people hear 50%, they say, well, it's a crapshoot, 50-50. It's not a 50-50 get it or not, it is a 50% reduction. So wherever you started at, you're 50% less likely to get that, or 40 or 60, depending on how effective it is that year. All right, this is one people, I should have put this in the beginning. I mean, fetal cells and vaccines. People talk about, well, there's fetal cells in vaccines, therefore it's unethical, or I'm not injecting fetal cells in my kid's body. I'm Catholic. I get that concern very, very deeply. There were two, the link is there. It talks a little bit about that in the video, but it's pretty long, so I'll try and give you the brief details. There were 2 elective abortions that happened in the 50s and 60s. those cells tend to be particularly good for this purpose, for making vaccines, and the descendants of those cells are used in making certain vaccines. We're not injecting fetal cells, all right? The vaccines were grown in the cells, but the cells themselves are gone. Is there remnants of that fetal DNA still in the vaccines? There is, all right? That much is true. This is, we have 50 plus years of data on this. This is not causing issues. Interestingly, this has gone all the way up to the Pope, all right? Is this okay as a Catholic to get an injection that involves aborted fetal cells? I think it was Pope, don't quote me on this, I may be wrong. I think it was Pope Benedict that came out of this. And basically they said it's unfortunate that this happened this way, but the fact that that happened all those years ago does not mean that we should not take the benefits that are here and now. And it is very explicitly not against Catholic doctrine to get these vaccines. Okay? So if you're Catholic or similar, maybe that's helpful. But that's where that comes from. So that there is a grain of truth to that, right? There is something behind that, and that's where a lot of conspiracy things start from. There's a grain of truth, and then they kind of blow it up and expand it to make it sound very scary. I didn't get to you guys done yet, or I got one more that we can talk about. Meningococcal disease. That's the one I bypassed initially. So meningitis is pretty rare but devastating. This is the trend in meningitis. This is rate per 100,000 people. So at its highest peak is 1.5 per 100,000 people. Fairly rare even then. And it's gone up and down some. It was actually starting to go down a little bit when we introduced the vaccine. So people say, well, it's going away on its own. Well, this is the natural variation. It's never been down here. Once we introduced the vaccine for meningitis A, it's gone way down. So it's pretty darn rare. The thing with meningitis is it's devastating. When you get meningitis, you start to hemorrhage everywhere. Your eyes, your skin. This is a very mild picture. I looked up all sorts of, I found all sorts of pictures of babies missing limbs from gangrene and all that sort of stuff. I decided it was too disturbing to put up here. It's really bad when it happens. So even though it's fairly rare, it's worthwhile doing. There are two types of meningitis vaccines. There's the one that's been around for a while, the meningitis A, CWY. This has been available since 2005. For a while, we've been giving kids the dose at 11 and 12. We found that they really need a booster before they go off to college or the military. So we're giving that booster at age 16. Again, this is what's primarily responsible for this decline. It's worked quite well. Hasn't had issues with any signals of increased side effects or problems from that. More recently, there's been the meningococcal serogroup B vaccines. MenB, Trememba is one of the examples. This is a little bit more complicated. It was available since late 2014. Meningitis B is similarly devastating. It is even more rare. And it becomes rare enough, there's about half a dozen kids who died nationwide. There's a lot more that can't hear and have lost limbs and stuff like that, so it's not that it never happens. But it's rare enough, and the vaccine's new enough that it's hard to make a real strong recommendation to say everybody should get this. I think it's too early to say that, and the American Council on Immunization Practices feels that way, that it may be given. So when would you think about it? Well, if you're going to particularly high-risk areas like the military, you probably want to do that. Kids who have certain immune deficiencies or are higher risk, you want to do that. For the average kid, boy, I don't know. I haven't even made up my mind on this. And I have a kid who's going to go to college next year, and I probably will have to go. may depend a little bit. I have to look up the statistics on meningitis B and wherever she goes to college in that state before I even make that decision. It's optional, and time will probably tell whether it's routinely recommended or not. Yes?
How do you catch it?
How do you catch meningitis? Yeah, highly contagious. In clusters where it happens, it spreads very rapidly. It's airborne transmission. So that's you just catch it from somebody else you're close to in close contact. That's why the military and colleges tend to be something.
Yeah, but where does it come from to begin with? You have to catch something from something where it develops.
Right, it's been in the population for ages. We can't go back far enough to know who had it first. So, I didn't talk about tetanus vaccines. Anybody have any concern with that? It is one that we often don't keep up with. Tetanus is different because, like that mentioned in the video, you don't get it from another person. Tetanus lives in the soil, and the proverbial rusty nail. It's not a problem because it's rusty so much as that a rusty nail means it's been sitting in the soil and it's gotten this on it. But anytime you get a cut outdoors, it has the potential to give you tetanus. Tetanus is pretty rare. It is pretty devastating when it happens, and it's also very hard to treat once you have symptoms. Very easy to prevent, very hard to treat. It causes lockjaw, all your muscles lock up to the point you break bones from the muscles locking out. Yeah, it's awful. So good idea to get caught up with that, especially if you're a gardener, like to work outside, that sort of stuff. I tend to not push that as hard, and people who are more infirm and stay indoors are just not as much risk. Any other concerns, thoughts?
Is that tetanus thing two, you get one, and then so much time after do you have a second one?
Not in adults. You get one every 10 years. Though if you get a cut and it's been more than 5 years since your last tetanus shot, we recommend you get one because you just had an exposure. But if you haven't had a significant cut outdoors or been exposed, you can go 10 years between. And
Is that part of the three letters, tetanus and something else?
yeah, most oftentimes it's given as part of a Tdap. So it's tetanus, diphtheria, and acellular pertussis. Pertussis is whooping cough, and we're seeing a little bit of that coming up again. Again, that was the video that I saw. We had some cases in Milledgeville a while back. So often with tetanus, we're giving people a booster of pertussis as well, which is a good idea.
Is that just one shot then?
One every 10 years.
Oh, so I was recommended to get one last fall because I'd never had one before. Well, for many years. I guess I got one in the service, but nothing since then.
Yeah, and so you won't need one for another 10 years.
If I last that long.
What's in the vaccines? You say you give us a shot, for like you just said, that part there, and that what's in the vaccines? What kind of plants?
What kind of plants? There usually isn't much in the way of plants in the vaccines. Most of them are grown in eggs. Some of the newer ones and some of the, and this is why people with egg allergies can have problems. Though interestingly, we're seeing that's much less an issue than we thought. Most of the time, even if you have a minor egg allergy, if you don't, swell up and can't breathe after you have an egg, you probably still have it. And there are now influenza immunizations that are just synthesized in labs that don't involve eggs. A little more, right now it's a little more expensive to do, so it's a little less common, but it's becoming more common. So in those cases, there's no plants, there's no eggs. It is just made in the lab exactly as we want it. Did that answer your question? Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate you guys being involved. And so you can go ask your providers for another shot, which I'm sure will be exciting.